Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Pestilus, the Lord of the Swarm, and so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Pestilus is a ranged support champion who excels in healing and supporting his teammates with his heals and his whole range of supportive abilities. Pestilus has access to some very strong burst healing options and can therefore keep his teammates alive very well. His burst healing potential is really one of the best in the game. In terms of control, he has access to some decent control abilities as well to support his team when needed. It is mostly about panics though for Pestilus. In terms of damage, Pestilus can dish out some good damage when he needs to as well when compared to other support champions. And so I think that he is definitely quite a well-rounded support champion which can do a bit of everything basically. While some of his skills may seem complicated at first, I think that Pestilus is actually somewhat of a beginner-friendly champion since it is not too complicated to know when and where you should use his skills effectively. So yeah, before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Jumong and Freya to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Pestilus' abilities before talking about his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at his Battlerites options before we finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Pestilus. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about his abilities one by one. Starting with his left click or mouse on ability, Moth. This ability is his basic attack and healing ability. The ability is basically just a normal projectile attack which deals damage to enemies it hits and heals allies that it hits. With each successful attack, Pestilus also gets healed for a small amount, and so that is quite nice I think. All teammates or enemies hit by this basic attack is also applied the Moth buff or debuff depending on whether you are with or against Pestilus. The Moth buff is basically just a heal over time for the ally, and so when the buff heals the ally, Pestilus is actually healed for a bit as well. On the other hand, the Moth debuff applied onto enemies is basically just a damage over time debuff, but now when the debuff does damage to the enemies, Pestilus is also healed for a bit. What all these buff-debuff stuff means is that Pestilus should try to aim to spread the Moth to as many people as possible to maintain that self-healing that goes on from all these buffs or debuffs, as well as the healing and damage that goes out to the other champions of course. So yeah, a little complicated, but pretty simple if you just think about what you need to do with it. Moving on, Pestilus' right click or mouse 2 ability is Bloodsucker, and this is his main burst damage and heal ability. It is a projectile attack that launches after a short cast time, which deals massive damage onto an enemy, or it can also deal massive healing to an ally. To cast this, Pestilus actually has to deal some damage to himself as well, and so you need to be careful not to overdo with it, since you might easily put yourself in a dangerous position otherwise. If you always make sure you have enough self-healing after you use this ability, then that would be good. So yeah, pretty simple ability, but definitely don't ignore the drawbacks. Next up, Pestilus' spacebar ability is Infest, and this is his only movement ability. What it does is Pestilus can dash in a direction, even through walls, and if he hits any enemies or allies, Pestilus can actually infest them and sort of just sit inside them for a few seconds. If you jump into an ally, you will heal both of you affected for a decent amount, and while you're inside the ally, since you cannot cast abilities other than casting spacebar to jump out earlier, your ally will receive only 25% of damage dealt to them, which is potentially pretty huge. When you sit in an ally, not only do you avoid any damage on yourself since you cannot be targeted, but your ally only receives a small amount of damage. And so in certain situations where you're both about to get hit by a very hard hitting ability, like Freya's ultimate or something, which your teammate can't get out in time, then you can just sit inside him as Pestilus to make him receive less damage while you avoid the damage completely. Pretty sweet. If you infested an enemy, the enemy that you infested will instead receive 25% more damage from your ally or allies, and so this could be a good way of focus firing an enemy as well, while avoiding enemy abilities at the same time of course. So all in all, Infest is a pretty versatile movement ability. Generally it will be used defensively since it is your only movement ability, but it can do much more than that in the right situations. Moving on, Pestilus' Q ability is Queen, and this is another of his burst heal ability. What the ability does is that a queen will be placed at a targeted location, and the moment that queen is placed down, nearby allies are healed for a large amount and will continue to be healed for as long as the queen is alive. The queen has 30 HP and a 5 seconds duration, and after this 5 seconds is over, it will deal 24 damage to all nearby enemies. Pretty strong I would say. If enemies kill it though, then the heal over time will stop and there would be no damage as well. If you land your mouse 2 on the Queen as Pestilus, the Queen will explode immediately to deal damage to all nearby enemies, and Pestilus will not suffer the 15 damage that he deals to himself when he casts his mouse 2 ability. Since the Queen is a separate entity, it can actually take shots and hits from enemies for you, which is sometimes useful, and you can also heal it up as Pestilus to keep it up as long as possible for the heals or the explosion damage. That was quite a lot of information. Don't worry if it feels like it was an overload of information, because gameplay wise it isn't too complicated to know what to do with the Queen. Next up, Pestilus's E ability is Arachnophobia, and this is his main control ability. What it does is that Pestilus will throw an egg at the targeted location, and when this lands, enemies in the area will be panicked and they will run away from the center of the explosion with increased movement speed. Pretty simple but useful ability for zone control and CC basically. Nothing much to say about this ability other than it is also quite useful when you're trying to get melees off of the central orb maybe. So those were all of Pestilus's abilities that doesn't require energy. Now let us talk about those which do. Pestilus's R ability is called Swarm, and what it does for 25 energy is shield a targeted ally for a short duration. The shield can absorb up to 28 damage, but once it is destroyed by the enemy, the morph debuff will be spread to nearby enemies. For this reason, you'll want to use this just before hard hitting attacks land on you or your teammate to make the most out of the shield. So like imagine putting the shield on an ally just before a Jade snipe hits them, it will absorb like 28 damage and spread the morph debuff to, well, Jade and her ally. Pretty sweet I would say. Next up, Pestilus's first EX ability is his shift right click ability, Vomit. It is a 25 energy ability that is basically a short range conal AoE attack in front of Pestilus. The attack deals a bit of damage to all enemies that it hits, and it also knocks them back slightly. The morph debuff is applied to the affected enemies, and they are also rooted in place for a short while after being knocked back. This ability is pretty good to be used defensively when fighting against enemy melee champions, since they will be knocked back and rooted, and this might make it difficult for them to continue chasing you down. Otherwise, it can also be used offensively to hold targets in place for you and your teammate to do lots of damage to them. Pretty versatile I would say. Just bear in mind that if you use this ability, you will not be able to use your normal mouse 2 ability for a short while, which is arguably one of your best abilities, so you gotta weigh up the drawbacks of using this ability. Moving on, Pestilus's second EX ability is his Shift E ability, Brain Bug. For 25 energy, Pestilus can throw a brain bug that infests the enemy, allowing Pestilus to control its movement for a short while. The control effect lasts for as long as 2 seconds, or until the 20 damage limit has been reached on the target, whereby the effect will end. I suppose this ability can be useful for making enemies run into your teammates' abilities, or even your own abilities. You can also use this to make enemies run out the play area during sudden death as well, for the fun of it. So yeah, quite an interesting ability I would say. The only downside is that you don't get to use your E after using this, so trying to zone enemies with your E or trying to CC multiple enemies at once will have to wait till it is off cooldown. Finally, Pestilus's ultimate on the F key is Scarab Pact, and what it does is Pestilus will summon 3 scarabs that he can use to attack enemies with or heal allies with. Enemies that he hits with the scarabs take a large amount of damage, and they will be given the Scarab debuff. This Scarab debuff deals another 24 damage over 4 seconds onto the enemy as well, and so it is definitely very powerful. Allies that are hit with Scarab instead are healed for quite a large amount, and the Scarab buff put onto them will also heal them for 24 damage over 4 seconds. A common mistake for Pestilus is to use the ultimate ability, but forget to use his other abilities. Pestilus can actually still use his other abilities while using his ultimate, so don't forget that. Just be careful that the Scarab Pack doesn't last for very long, so you might want to use the 3 available charges quickly. And so that's about it for Pestilus's abilities. Now let us move on to his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Pestilus's playstyle is a bit more of a passive one. While he can deal some decent burst damage, I think that he excels when he's played more defensively and just sort of poke and damage from afar while healing up himself or his teammates as necessary. The reason for this is that his queen is stationary until you can get a certain Battlerites later in the match, which allows you to move the queen a little bit. Since being near the queen offers lots of benefits, you want to be near to the queen as Pestilus and just go from there. If paired against hyper aggressive teammates, I think it might be a good choice to tell your teammates to come back to you for healing once in a while, rather than chasing them down all over the place with Pestilus, since his movement isn't really the best. Typically, my game plan when playing Pestilus is to keep my teammates alive first and foremost. I do this by using my mouse 1 on teammates as often as I can, and trying to make sure the morph buffs are on them all the time. If enemies are in range, I try to mouse 1 onto them too to maintain the morph debuff on on them. Since those buff and debuffs also give yourself some heals per second, it is quite good to maintain the buff or debuff on each player if you can, and you can even maintain it on your queen too while it is alive, so that's pretty cool. Whenever your mouse 2 is off cooldown, you should try to find an opportunity to use it. Pestilus' mouse 2 ability is arguably his most powerful ability, at least in my opinion. The burst damage it provides is crazy, and so if you don't need to use it to heal up an ally, go ahead and use it on the enemies. Don't forget that if you have the chance, you can also mouse 2 the queen to deal some AoE damage as well. When not using mouse 1 or mouse 2, you should be trying to find opportunities to use your Chyill ability. When using it, I think that you should definitely use it primarily for the burst heal, and then if possible just keep it up for a bit for some zone control or AoE damage. Melee enemies tend to avoid it unless they can burst it down, while ranged enemies may try to attack it for free energy and charges, or just take it down so you don't get the free healing per second while in its area of effect. At that point though, if you have already used it for the burst heal, it has at least served most of its purpose. Any extra value you get out of it is just bonus, I would say, but helpful nonetheless. When you're not using any of those abilities, mouse 1, mouse 2 or Q, you can use R to shield yourself or allies when necessary, use spacebar to get out of sticky situations as I explained in the abilities section, or you can also use your E ability to CC or zone enemies. If you like, spending some energy for using the Shift E for combos could work as well. Pestilus' ultimate can be pretty strong when used well, but I think definitely only use it when you're not under pressure. The reason for this is that the cast time on the ultimate is pretty long, and so you might be vulnerable while casting it. Being far away isn't an issue for the ultimate, since the range of the ability is actually very long. I typically use it for damage, since the damage from the ability is very good. But sometimes if needed, you can go ahead and heal allies with it as well. It shouldn't be a problem. So yeah, that's mostly it for Pestilus' playstyle. Very typical passive support type of playstyle, since that's what Pestilus is. You just sort of have to react to the situation and try to make favorable trades is what I think. Moving on to Pestilus' strengths, I think that one of his biggest strengths is his ability to burst heal. Not many supports can do such good burst healing, and so I think this is one point where he shines. It is often difficult for enemies to deal true damage to Pestilus' teammates because of this, and so enemies often have to overcommit just to try to deal those true damage. When they overcommit is when you as Pestilus together with your teammate can try to take the opportunity to punish them for overcommitting. Next up, I think that another one of Pestilus' strengths is his burst damage as well. He seems to be pretty strong with doing burst anything it seems. Anyway, why I say this is because his mouse 2 can deal 30 damage straight up. True damage starts to occur once enemies lose more than 40 health, and those lost health are not healed back up. And so for this reason, all you need is an enemy who has been dealt 10 damage, which is maybe just one of your normal mouse 1 attack, then you'll start doing true damage if you hit them again with a mouse 2. This is a pretty big deal since you can very easily drop their health to take true damage, and they will be under a bit more pressure, which is always good I suppose. Moving on, I think that another strength of Pestilus is his ability to really hold down a position. It is hard to get Pestilus to move away from a certain position, especially if he has his queen, AoE panic, strong burst healing and all that. For this reason, if you as Pestilus and your team manage to hold down the central position, this will be a very powerful position for you and your team since the enemies have to come to you and you don't have to try to chase them. This is very good for Pestilus I think. He's sort of like a turret of healing and damage to me. So those were some of his strengths. Now let us talk about his weaknesses. I think that Pestilus is a little bit weak in terms of self-healing. While every mouse 1 attack of his does a small bit of healing to him, and putting the buffs and debuffs also heal him, he needs a bit more healing than that to sustain his mouse 2 spam, and of course also the damage that he will be getting from enemies. His Q ability or the Queen spell is a good source of healing, but sometimes you may need to cast it on a far away ally for that burst heal, or to block an enemy projectile for example. Doing this will result in the ability going on cooldown, and so you will no longer have it ready to heal yourself with it, which can sometimes be troublesome I think. Next up, I think that Pestilus cannot really handle pressure very well. That's not to say he's really bad at it, but he is just slightly weak to it seems. While he could put down his queen and try to play around it when melee enemies are trying to rush him down or perhaps spacebar away and stuff, I think that these plays are a little bit more defensive and wouldn't really scare people off as much sometimes. He might sometimes need his allies to help him out with melee enemies chasing him down I feel. And finally, I think that Pestilus is also weaker against highly mobile ranged champions, as well as high burst damage champions. Champions like Taya and Ashka are good examples for mobile ranged champions, and high burst damage champions like Jumong, Rukan, Jade. The reason for this is that highly mobile ranged champions can kite Pestilus and make it hard for him to do his thing. He doesn't really excel in chasing, and so these mobile ranged champs can just run circles and chip away at him. Champions with strong burst damage is also pretty good against Pestilus since they can burst his queen down super quick, and this makes Pestilus a lot weaker when trying to hold down a certain position. And so that's about it for his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Pestilus' Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish before I go through my thoughts on his Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read them all, let's continue. In the first round, I think the best pick will usually be Brute Mother, in general at least. The panic from the queen exploding is a pretty good way of getting melee enemies off of you, and so I think it is quite good just for that reason. Putting Chyill down for some burst heals followed by a mouse 2 to explode the queen for some damage and panic makes for a pretty good combo. While the extra survivability from Scourge is pretty good, I find that it is a bit too defensive, and when compared with the panic from Brute Mother, it just feels a little lacking. Brute Mother makes the queen that much more lethal and makes Pestilus' Q ability that much better at zone control. Colony can be a pretty good pickup since it is a quick and easy way of spreading morph to enemies for some damage, plus some healing on yourself. However, I think it is way easier to land 2 or 3 mouse 1s consecutively on the different targets for the same effect than it is to mouse 1 an enemy and follow it up with a mouse 2 after that for the same effect. So while the bonus from Colony is nice, Brute Mother just offers so much more in my opinion. The only time when Brute Mother becomes a bit lacking is perhaps against an all-ranged enemy team, then maybe Colony might be okay there, or Scourge if you like. But I find that you don't really want to be out of combat for too long with Scourge, since you'll be leaving your teammate alone for too long. In the second tier, I think that there are some pretty good choices here. Hardened Carapace is a solid pick if you're playing the Queen build, since it will make it last against Jade Snipe and all that burst in the first second. That way you can at least get some healing out of it. Not only that, for those non-penetrating projectiles, it can completely block a shot for you, so I think that's pretty useful as well. The only time Hardened Carapace isn't as good is when against lots of melee champions, since they tend to have less bursty abilities, and so the invulnerability for the Queen matters less. You'll likely be trying to explode the Queen as much as possible anyways, to get enemy melee champions off of you rather than keeping the Queen alive. If you need more control, 8 Carrier can be pretty good pickup for massive disruption. The second E ability bounce actually lands pretty quickly, and so you can quite effectively panic most of the enemy team just using your E ability with the bounce. It is pretty helpful against melee champions sometimes as well, since you can aim it near and it will bounce almost on top of itself, making it that much easier to hit an enemy with it. If you find yourself getting focused a lot, Spores is pretty good since it gives your teammate a bit more help while you're out of combat for a while. The bonuses it gives is pretty significant, and so it should not be completely disregarded. If you pick Scourge in the first round, then Spores will be even better since you effectively have doubled the duration of Infest. So yeah, some pretty good choices this round. Typically I play the Queen build, so I take Hardened Carapace most of the time. If I think I need the extra panic, then 8 Carrier it is. Moving on, in the third tier, I think that it is mostly a choice between Hive Mind and Insectivore. Disperse is quite fun, since you can push people around with it, but the pushback isn't really that far at all, and so I don't think it is that worth it. Not to mention the bonus damage being quite low as well. Between Insectivore and Hive Mind, I think that Hive Mind has some pretty good control potential, since you can potentially move the Queen into range of enemies and follow it up with a quick mouse 2 to explode it. If you took Brute Mother in the first tier, then you have the panic effect as well, which is pretty nice. If you're not looking to combo these abilities together that way, then Insectivore is overall a very solid choice, since it is essentially a big buff to your most powerful ability. The mouse 2 consuming moth isn't a big deal since a follow-up mouse 1 attack will just reapply it. If you're not too sure what to pick this round, then Insectivore is the safest pick, since Hive Mind needs some pre-planning with what you want to do with the Queen. In the fourth tier are some decent choices again. Blight is really good at controlling enemy melee enemies, and sometimes even ranged enemies as well if you have a melee teammate nearby that can use the benefits of a Queen there. The 30% slow is significant enough and should give you very good control and survivability as well against melee enemies when you're near to your Queen. If you pick Spores in the second tier, Defiler is a decent pick, since the longer duration will make it more worth it to actually make use of the effects of Spore. Otherwise, Overlord is a pretty good solid choice in most cases. If you are good at applying morph to each player, the movement speed bonus is quite significant and would be very helpful for Pestilus since he isn't as mobile. He can dodge easier, chase easier and all that, so I think it is a decent choice. Finally, in the fifth and final tier, I think that both picks are strong picks. Lord of the Flies will boost your survivability tremendously at the start of the duration of your ultimate, since you have 3 scarabs for a total of 75% damage reduction. Even 50% and 25% is still pretty significant, and so I think that it is quite good if you think you'll be focused while you're using your ultimate ability. For more offensive plays, Blind Beetle can be very good because you can effectively blind enemies and make it hard for them to coordinate a response to you and your team's attacks. Very powerful indeed. Of course, the drawbacks is that you don't get the survival boost from the other Battlerites. The choice will be up to you depending on the matchup and aggressiveness of the enemies, I suppose. And so yeah, that's about it on Pestilus' Battlerites. Now let's move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Pestilus, as well as some potential combos with him. My first tip for playing Pestilus is to really make sure you aim and hit your mouse tool well. Because it deals 15 damage to yourself, you want to make sure that it hits the right person and you make full use of its effects as often as possible. The ability is seriously one of Pestilus' strongest abilities, and so definitely practice getting used to its casting time and animation. And get used to using it as often as you can as well, whether for damage or healing. Just don't forget to have a backup plan if things don't go correctly and you need to heal yourself after that. Moving on, another tip I have for playing Pestilus is to take advantage of his strength at holding down a position. Pestilus and his teammate or teammates should be able to easily hold on to the central location because of how Pestilus works as a champion, and so definitely try your best to secure that strong starting position and try not to lose it. You don't want to try chase enemies too far away from the central position, since this can give them the opportunity to take it back from you. It is fairly important to work to Pestilus' strength, since if he starts chasing and gets caught out of position, it can be quite easy for him to burst it down, because enemies can sometimes easily avoid his panic from the E ability, and the shield that Pestilus have isn't that strong. These are assuming you've used up the spacebar and it is on cooldown, of course. Next up, a third tip I have for playing Pestilus is to prioritize healing over damage with your mouse 1 attacks. A lot of your damage will come from your mouse 2, so when you're faced with the decision to damage with your mouse 1 or to heal with your mouse 1, I think it's best to heal, even though it can be tempting to sometimes just go for attacks all the way. I say that it is sometimes tempting to attack all the way because it is easy to get carried away attacking enemies when you've just dealt 30 damage to them straight with your mouse 2 ability. But yeah, don't forget that you want to hold the superior position, and so the healthier your teammates are, the easier it is to hold that strong position, since the enemy has more health to chew through before getting to dealing true damage on you or your teammates. This isn't just a physical barrier to them trying to reclaim the central position, but it also makes enemies fearful to engage because their health bars are lower than yours. At that point, not only do they feel the pressure of being at lower health levels, but they're also under time pressure, since the longer they don't have the control of the center, the bigger the advantage your team has. Just remember not to be too complacent and give up the advantage. So yeah, it seems like most of the tips relate to holding a position, but I think it is really one of Pestilus' strong points to hold that key positional advantage, and so definitely try to get used to doing that. On to some combos with Pestilus. I think he doesn't really have that many combos, but of course the few basic ones are like a Q followed up with the mouse 2 for the explosion damage. This is even stronger with the Brute Mother Battlerites giving the panic on explosion, so it is definitely good to get used to during this combo when melees get close to you. Practicing the moving Queen Battlerites with this combo is also super effective, since now you have a long range AoE damaging poke. Pretty cool. Another combo you can do is to E into mouse 2. The panic from E makes enemies run in a straight line, and so that makes it far easier to aim your mouse 2 for a guaranteed hit. Otherwise, EXE followed by a mouse 2 works as well, but then you won't be able to move them unless you move them first before shooting your mouse 2. Just be careful of the rather short duration of the mind control ability. So yeah, those were just some of the few basic combos off the top of my head for Pestilus. Probably good to practice them a little bit since they can be pretty handy. With regards to teammates, I think that Pestilus really shines with teammates with strong range poke potential and staying power. Basically champions that hold positions well too, just like him. Champions like Jumong, Ashka, Rukhan, Odur are some good examples of champions who can go well with Pestilus. It is super difficult to break through the defenses of some of these team compositions, and so that's why I think Pestilus goes well together with those type of champions. It might be harder for Pestilus to keep up with an aggressive melee teammate, but as long as they occasionally come back in range of your heals, I think it is still okay. And so overall, I think that Pestilus is actually a very strong support champion. After all, he did get a few nerfs to various parts of his kit, and so he's certainly a strong champion design-wise. Even after the nerfs, he can still hold his ground pretty well, and so that shows that he's definitely a strong support in the right hands, I suppose. Playing him is pretty simple, and so it shouldn't be too hard to learn him as well, just as long as you get into the right mindset when playing him, and that is to hold the positional advantage in the center. And so yeah, that's about it for my Pestilus guide. I hope you found it useful. The next guide I have in line should be a serious guide from a previous poll, but since the new champion, Blossom the Druid, is coming out in a few days time, I will cover her in my next guide instead. I'm so excited for the new champion. It's been months since the last new champion. Because of this new champion release, there will be no poll again in this video where you can usually vote for a future champion guide that I will make. So yeah, that about wraps up what I have to say in this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, keep on gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.